This is Chapter 9, which is on prejudice. Let's define prejudice first. The textbook defines it as a preconceived negative judgment of a group and its individual members. Prejudice is an attitude, which we just discussed, attitude and behavior. Attitude, as we just discussed, is a combination of feelings, inclinations to act, and beliefs. What's a stereotype? Stereotype is the belief portion of prejudice. It's a specific belief or assumption, the thoughts that you have about individuals based completely on their membership in a group, regardless of their individual characteristics. And the example I used in the picture to the left is we tend to stereotype men as doing certain things and women as doing certain things. So we assume that if we see a man, he must do these things without looking at that person individually. I think this is a great model of the differences between prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes. We just discussed that stereotypes are the cognitive component or the thoughtful component of prejudice. Discrimination is the behavioral component of prejudice, what you actually do. And we know that prejudice is the affective component, how you feel. So prejudice is the negative attitude, discrimination is the negative behavior, and as the previous slide indicated, stereotypes are negative beliefs. Merely feeling a prejudice isn't enough. Someone has to act on their attitude for it to qualify as discrimination. So discrimination, again, is the behavioral component. In the previous chapter, we also discussed implicit attitudes versus explicit attitudes. Implicit prejudice and bias versus explicit are essentially the same thing. Implicit is unconscious. It happens without thinking. It's spontaneous. A good example in the diagram is choosing a seat next to someone of your own race. That's not something you really consciously think about. It's just kind of happens automatically. Whereas an explicit bias or prejudice is thoughtful. You have to think about it. It's a conscious action or thought, and it's a very organized, conscious thought. In other words, if I say, well, I can't hire someone who is this, I'm consciously thinking about that. So we all have conscious biases and prejudices and implicit ones. So what are some types of prejudice? There's racial prejudice, gender prejudice, LGBT prejudice, and there are, as I'm sure you can think of, many other types of prejudice that we have. So what creates prejudice? We kind of know what it is now. We know what prejudice, discrimination, stereotypes are. What creates it? Well, it seems that unequal status breeds prejudice. Those high in social dominance orientation tend to view people in terms of hierarchies. They like their own social group to be high status. They prefer being on the top. So it seems that they become prejudiced toward people in lower status. Socialization. Children often simply mirror the prejudice seen in their parents and caregivers. We simply copy what we see our parents do, and we develop those behaviors and those thoughts and attitudes. And research has shown that authoritarian personalities tend to be more prone to prejudice. An authoritarian personality is someone who really likes structure and order. They think very rigidly, adhere to traditional norms. We discussed norms a little bit earlier. And research has shown, like I said, that they're more prone to being prejudiced. Conformity. If prejudice is socially accepted, many people will follow the path of least resistance and conform to the fashion. They will follow social norms, not out of a need to hate, but of a need to be liked and accepted. In other words, they're not prejudiced because they want to hate someone else. They just want to follow the social norm and do what everybody else in their group is doing, which if that's following a certain prejudice, they'll follow it also to be liked by the group. Social institutions, which could include schools, government, media, or families, may bolster prejudice through overt policies, such as segregation, or by more passively reinforcing the status quo. Institutional supports for prejudice are often, as it previously mentioned, passive, which means they're unintended and unnoticed. They're not overt, it's not segregation, but it's just like an institutional prejudice. It goes unnoticed. Realistic group conflict theory, prejudice arises when groups compete for scarce resources. You can imagine this is probably going to put people in a hierarchy. Whoever has more resources is best, so that can create prejudice between groups. In-group versus out-group thinking. We tend to think that the groups we belong to are the best, which isn't always a negative thing. Groups can promote a feeling of belonging and social solidarity. However, it can also make us think we're the best, therefore we're prejudiced against other groups. The group-serving bias is when a member of our group exhibits negative behavior. We tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. When someone like us, we tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. Oh, well, it was just the situation. It's not who they really are. But when someone in an out group, in a group that we're not in, displays a negative behavior, we often assume the worst. We often assume that it must be who they are. It must be their traits. So how do we avoid prejudice? Simply the motivation to avoid prejudice can lead people to modify their thoughts and actions. Aware of the gap between how they should feel and how they do feel, self-conscious people will feel guilt and try to inhibit their prejudicial response. So simply trying to avoid it does help you avoid it. Let's look a little further at stereotypes, which we know from earlier are the cognitive or thoughtful component of prejudice. So why do we stereotype? Well, our brains, as I think we've discussed this before, like to categorize and organize the world by putting not only objects but people in groups. This allows for making speedy judgments and predicting how others will think and act. We are likely to exaggerate the similarities within the groups and the differences between them. So our brains just don't like random objects and organization. They like to organize and put things in groups. And that tends to make us be prejudiced towards certain groups and put people in certain groups. So what are the consequences of prejudice? Preconceived judgments, judging someone before we know them. Prejudgments guide our attention and our memories, and prejudgments are self-perpetuating. In other words, when we see one of their stereotypes in action, this encourages our further belief in that stereotype. Self-fulfilling prophecy, an expectation or belief that can influence your behaviors, thus causing the belief to come true. And stereotype threat, an apprehension that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype and diminished performance as a result. Thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.